Hello, fellow druids. I have a listener submitted topic here. I'm going to call this "Kill, Maim, and Avoid." One of the folks in the Full Circle Facebook group had what I thought was a pretty interesting topic, and he said when. And let me perhaps actually read a little bit of it. But basically, he's asking for tactical discussion on when it's best to try to kill something versus mitigate it. So I'm going to go through. This is certainly not going to be all encompassing by any stroke of the imagination, but we're going to try to go through how to approach different tactics as far as that's concerned. Some of it's going to depend on how you've built your list, how your opponent has built their list, and where we are in the game, right? So early on in the game, you essentially want to, one of the things you want to identify early is your win condition or possible win conditions, right? So if you're able to play for attrition, you want to be able, you want to make sure you're trying to remove as many models from the table as you can, either infantry models or their heavies and things like that. And if you're in a situation where that is something that you're doing, even early on, you may identify that you're going to be able to do that, or you're going to fail to do that. So if you're able to remove their models from the table, either by killing them or whatever, by just killing them, I guess, you should do that, right? So examples of that are going to be things like in another video I talked about Chromac 2, right? He's going to bring warp wolves. Those warp wolves are going to want to try to remove threats. They're generally premium heavies. They're generally things that are good at killing, and then you are going to want to try to do that. So you should be able to use something like a stalker to trade into another heavy with the correct buffs and situations, and be successful at doing that. So that's one thing. However, you want to look at the situation you're at and what your expected output is going to be. Playing into certain Khador lists and certain troll lists, for example, are very good places to identify this. So sometimes you want to avoid the fight altogether, at least briefly. Striker 1 is a good example. Unless you have like an assassination on like their squishy caster. So like Striker 1's a good example. If you do have, so like my Una 2 list, for example, my Kruger 2 list, I've done this. Those lists don't bring they bring some armor cracking, but they're not bringing enough to get through armor 25 or even, frankly, armor 24 or 26, whatever it is, colossals that list brings. So if you can get to Striker and assassinate him, do that. However, if you can't, don't throw your whole battle group into trying to kill his colossal, because you're not going to. I'd have to do the math, but I think Una. I don't know if there's enough Griffins in the world for Una to kill a striker feated arcane shielded colossal, even with Wraithbane thrown in there. I could be wrong, but it's just not going to be worth it. You are going to want to avoid that fight as much as possible. So in circumstances like that, hopefully you have models, and like even shifting stones in your list might be the right thing for this. Hopefully you have models you can just put in the way, try your best to contest any scenario zones that you don't want to give up. You don't want to be ceding points. That's something they're hoping for. You don't want to cede an assassination, so keep your casters safe. But just try to put enough in to blunt that alpha and give yourself another turn, because if you don't do that, you're going to throw things that are just going to bounce off their models. It's not going to do any good, and then you're going to end up losing on attrition really hard and have to go for probably a really long, really like bad odds assassination if they even give it to you. So don't do that. But if we're not talking about a situation like that, trolls are the same way. There's a lot of troll feats that do that, so just keep those things in mind. There's other situations where you may want to approach things differently as well. If it's later in the game and you are winning on scenario, you want to be very judicious with what pieces you use, right? It might be more beneficial at that point to use your war piece for things like slams or throws to enable you to score more points. It may also even just make sense in some cases to jam models into them full well knowing they will die, but by setting a line of engagement past the scenario to allow you to score your final points. Fast lists can do things like that sometimes. A Kruger is very good for things like that, right? Set the line of engagement, add in some TKs and things. Druids in a list can do that with their pushes. You want to look at that. You also want to look at your list construction, right? If you don't have the models to do large amounts of attrition all at once, you're going to want to be using models that aren't really doing a lot of work for you to get in the way, to put a little bit of chip damage in, to do other sorts of things to support you stabilizing long enough that the things that could possibly do work, or the assassination you need to set up, or the scenario win, you're able to do so. So recognizing in that way. Sometimes it's going to make sense to, generally speaking, you don't want to spread a lot of damage around to a lot of different models, but in some cases it will actually be profitable, specifically into warjacks that don't have access to a lot of repair. You may want to try to kill the things that could repair if they do have them, and then things like slayers very easily lose arms and are are considerably less effective after having done so. Really, any system that goes out on a warjack is going to be make them notably less effective, depending on what you brought and things like that. Like the axe going off of a juggernaut is pretty helpful to you. Slayers losing arms is not actually all that difficult to engineer. Or if again you can make them lose like their cortex, so there's no more, so they don't have access to focus, then they're only doing so much as well, or like, you know, so on and so forth. So in games like that, you may, and it depends on your list construction, have the ability to spread damage around and do well. Otherwise, you generally want to focus your attacks, especially into like Grimkin with the sacrifice Arcana, where that will heal them back up to full. Definitely don't spread your damage around there. You want to try to kill things one at a time and make sure that they're not getting as much as is reasonable, that they're not getting benefit out of that Arcana, whatever. Another thing is look at the way you construct your list. So let's look at like Shadowhorn Satyrs in a list, for example, are 12 points. Whereas stuff like Feral Warpwolves, Sketerics, Stalkers, even Wolds, things like that are much pricier. So if you can use like a throw on a Shadowhorn Satyr to engineer a situation where that's the piece that you traded because you put it very far forward, used it to perform that throw to send a heavy back to your list. Well, now you've, you know, say it's let's talk the Juggernaut again, right? Let's say you have your Shadowhorn throw the Juggernaut back at your army, and maybe you're even able to sprint from that point. So now what you've done is put a 12-point beast that they probably should make an effort to deal with in their army, and they probably will be able to, while being able to kill their Jack with your more expensive pieces, which means that might have just been an even trade, which as Circle you're pretty okay with. Anytime you can trade up, you want to do so. So like Scarsfell's Griffins trade up very well. A fully loaded up Wild Argus can trade pretty well a lot of times, better than you may think. If you can trade those things like Gnarlhorn Satyrs, Shadowhorn Satyrs, that's pretty good. The Light Wolds are pretty good at trading, things like that. So again, you want to be looking at when you're trading pieces, you want to look at what you're gaining for what you're losing, right? Sometimes it's straight points. Sometimes it's also recognizing that while it may not be the most points efficient, it might be the correct play. So technically speaking, a Stalker and Getorix are more points than any Colossal that exists in the game. However, if you're talking about Signar, for example, and you can use the two of them to kill, say, their Stormwall, and that was the only real threat your battle group had in their list, then that trade is very likely going to be worthwhile. Things like that. If you can identify that there's only really one or two things that you're threatened by in their list, it might actually be worth losing points to get those things dead. if it's going to be that detrimental to how your list plays. Trying to think if there's any other scenarios off the top of my head that I'm thinking of. But generally you want to try to use what you have the most as efficiently as you can, and identify how you need to use your pieces. Some things, and recognize if the piece is more offensive or defensive, right? So you are going to need to, if you know that you're going to need to continue to kill things, and you have pieces that are more defensive, use those as sort of the trade pieces. So in yet another video that I recorded tonight, I talked about Bradigus, and if you're able to engineer a situation where you can trade, you can put your Wold Watchers into places that your opponent is going to have to really deal with them, while keeping Bradigus, your Wold Guardians, and possibly some other parts of your list safe, that's going to be a net positive for you, because those pieces are just more defensive by nature anyways. Same is true for a Baldur 2 list. Along the Baldur 2 list line, again, if you're on the other side of that equation, right, if they only have a few things that can threaten to kill your Woldrath, throwing extra things into those to make sure that they are killed is going to be the like at that point, once you're at that point and the armor 23 Woldrath can just run the table, then you're going to be in a pretty good position. So again, another thing to identify. Getarix works like that sometimes as well. And then finally, I would say the only other thing is how safe is your caster or your battle group. And sometimes you just want to be okay with losing something in order to make sure you don't lose the game, right? I've used shifting stones before, even though like setting them up to get teleports would be best to just prevent things from being able to land in certain places without them having to do some awkward plays, and sometimes that's going to be enough to do what you need to do. So anyway, that's kind of what I have to say on that. This is, like I said, this is very high level, very generic. You kind of need to, part of getting better at the game is recognizing like which dial to turn on those different things that I've said, and I'm by no means perfect at it. I have times where I'm very good at recognizing it, and other times where I don't recognize it until I'm in the car on the way home. So, but anyways, we'll wrap it up there. So again, thanks for the topic from the group. If you like my content, hit the subscribe button. Feel free to share us on social media. Feel free to join in the conversation here on YouTube, in the Facebook group, the Discord, or over on Twitter. And we will see you later.